Now, let us begin the first the first session for today's symposium. Part 1, we'll be talking about the importance of HDL for the prevention of chronic diseases. Let me invite the first speaker, Professor and Deputy Head of School of Biomedical Sciences, Dr. Kerry-Anne from UNSW, Sydney. She will tell us about the role of HDL in preventing and treating chronic diseases. Let us welcome the speaker with a big round of applause.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. I'm delighted to be here. I'd like to thank Dr. Lee and everyone from Radel for bringing us all together and sponsoring this symposium. So what I'm going to do today is cover quite a broad range of things. You're going to hear in a lot more detail some of the things I'll talk about later in the day. So if we begin, if we're talking about healthy aging, is there a role for HDL in this process, going from this upright young man to an elderly person who actually needs assistance with walking? And what are the determinants? So what do you need to age healthily? So there are several main determinants. There's economic determinants, behavioral and societal, and they're all equally important. I don't know that you can place an emphasis on any one of them more than the other, but it includes things like quality of life, appropriate housing, affordable healthcare is critically important, maintaining physical activity. You can't do what you were doing when you're 20, you can't do it when you're 80, but you can still be active, and also maintaining cognitive ability. And living independently for as long as possible, as well as maintaining social interactions, because loneliness is one thing that is particularly important and adverse in aging. So in aging, there are a lot of chronic diseases to which we are at risk of developing. They're listed here. I'm going to be talking about the ones in the top row, as well as a little bit right at the end about arthritis. Now, the main one I'm going to be focusing on today is atherosclerosis, or cardiovascular disease, and some of the other atherosclerotic diseases. The reason for that is most people die from atherosclerosis or cardiovascular disease of some form or other at the moment. So how does this happen? We start off with totally pristine arteries when we're children. Over the years, fatty streaks develop, which is the accumulation of fatty material or lipids in the artery wall. And this can develop over the years to an intermediate lesion and lesions that are much larger and beginning to be complex, and where you have stable atherosclerotic plaques, quite often totally asymptomatic. And there wouldn't be a person in this room that doesn't have some form of this disease. What happens towards the end of this disease is that you can get complex plaques that are not protected from the circulation by a cap that is thick and resistant to rupture. If a plaque becomes thin or eroded and ruptures, what happens is the contents of the plaque, which are very prothrombotic and can cause blood clots, they're released into the circulation. You get a blood clot and the artery is blocked, and there's your heart attack. So, to really appreciate how this happens, you actually need to go back to the beginning and talk about all lipoproteins, not just HDL. So if we start with these big yellow circles, so the two main lipoproteins that are the largest ones are called chylomicrons. That's where the fat that we ingest is packaged and released into the circulation, and very low density lipoproteins, or VLDL. They're synthesized in the liver and secreted into the circulation. They both contain triglycerides. So triglyceride-rich lipoproteins, they're not atherogenic. They're big, they can't get into the artery wall. And, but what happens is they're catabolized and they lose their triglycerides, become smaller, and they develop into remnant particles that can enter the artery wall, and they are atherogenic. VLDLs can also be catabolized all the way to low-density lipoproteins. This is the bad cholesterol that can cause heart attacks, causes atherosclerosis, and you want to do everything you can to lower LDL cholesterol levels. And then we come to high-density lipoproteins, which is the focus of today's discussion. So actually, what are these things? So high-density lipoproteins start off as small discoidal particles, and it's a phospholipid bilayer surrounded by proteins called apoproteins, very rapidly converted by an enzyme called LCAT that you will hear about later into spherical particles. And this is what you see when you're talking about high-density lipoproteins. The proteins on the surface of these particles, the two main proteins are ApoA1 and ApoA2. Not all HDL have both of these apoproteins. You can get particles that have only ApoA1, but there are a plethora of other proteins like ApoA4, ApoE, ApoC, and the ApoC apoproteins as well. The crux of the matter here is this. So you can have HDLs that range from quite large particles, a bit smaller than LDL, right down to these small HDL3C particles. They're always being interconverted from one to another, which makes them very difficult to study. And finally, there's lipid-free or lipid-poor ApoA1, also called pre-beta HDL or pre-beta A1. And what this is as particles get small and there's no room on the surface for them to be there anymore, they fall off. And they either are excreted through the kidney or reconverted back into HDL. So this interconversion of particles is called remodeling, and you can go from large particles to small, small particles to large, and no time to talk about it today, but these are some of the factors that regulate these processes. I'm going to be mentioning CETP or cholesterol ester transfer protein, but it's the only one. Also, they're regulated by the apoproteins on the surface, so it is a complex process. Makes it hard to understand. So, and we're missing a title here, but what I want to just mention very briefly is the risk factors associated with cardiovascular disease as a segue into how HDL can be involved. So the title that we're missing is unmodifiable risk factors. So factors that you can't change. One of them is age. As you get older, you have an increased risk of developing cardiovascular disease. Gender, so a female is protected much more from cardiovascular disease if she is premenopausal than a male. Postmenopausally, not so. Family history, and there are some genetic mutations that we know that will predispose people to developing cardiovascular disease. And there's the title. Modifiable risk factors, and these are things that we can do something about, include stopping smoking if you're a smoker, treating high blood pressure and high cholesterol levels, treating diabetes, reducing overweight and preventing obesity, and this is associated with reducing inactivity, so getting out there and doing whatever you're going to do to remain active, and also poor nutrition is a really big factor. So HDL is associated with a reduction in cardiovascular risk. So what this means is that as your HDL cholesterol level increases, your risk of developing cardiovascular disease reduces. Now, it's really important to remember that this is not a causal, it's not a causal thing. So you cannot say that HDL it reduces cardiovascular disease. It doesn't. It is associated with reducing the risk of developing cardiovascular disease. And even when you adjust for a lot of confounding factors, you see that this is a very robust association. How could this happen? So this gets down to a few things. Already a couple of them have been mentioned. So one of them is that low-density lipoproteins, these little pink circles in the lumen of the artery where blood flows through, can enter the artery wall where they get oxidized. The endothelium, which is a single layer of cells that protects the artery from the blood flow, if that becomes activated under inflammatory conditions, for example, it will start expressing adhesion molecules called VCAM1 and ICAM1. And what happens is that the monocytes, which are white blood cells in the circulation, will bind to these adhesion molecules, get through the endothelial monolayer and enter the subendothelial space, so into the artery wall, where they're converted into macrophages. And macrophages, they're the key things that you do not want. So what happens is they express receptors that will take up oxidized LDL, and it's unlimited. So anything that's there, they will take up, and you get all the cholesterol from the LDL accumulating in the macrophages, and the macrophages get eventually converted into foam cells, and you go on to develop atherosclerotic lesions. So where does HDL fit into all of this? Well, it will stop adhesion molecule expression in an activated endothelial cell. It will prevent the oxidation of low-density lipoproteins, or LDLs, and it will stop monocytes crossing the endothelial barrier into the subendothelial space in the artery wall. So there's a lot of good things it can do. Whether it does this in humans, we're not sure. The thing about cardiovascular disease is all of these protective functions are lost. So this is an example of a study of a cholesterol ester transfer protein, or CETP inhibitor, where it increased HDL levels. The inhibitor was called dalcetrapib. This was a trial that failed, but HDL levels did increase. And what's really interesting about this study is that you can see that the event rate of cardiovascular disease event rate in the subjects in this trial did not decrease as their HDL levels increase. Now, if you compare what you see on the right-hand side of the study, you'll see, right up, this is the same HDL cholesterol range as we had before. So right up to the very highest level, where you've got a very nice reduction in risk in a normal population, it just doesn't exist in a cardiovascular disease population. So the HDLs have actually lost their function. And this is just one example of how this happens. And this is just in an animal study. And if you put a non-occlusive silastic collar around the carotid artery of a rabbit, and it will set up an inflammatory response. And if you treat that rabbit with high-density lipoproteins, what you find is that you will not get expression of VCAM1. Remember, this is one of the adhesion molecules I mentioned before on the endothelial surface. And you will also not get increased expression of ICAM1. So let's move on to diabetes and its complications. So this is a real issue at the moment. It's a disease that's increasing at epidemic proportions. People actually don't die from diabetes, they die from the complications that are associated with it, whether it's microvascular or macrovascular or other diseases. And so where does HDL fit into this? I started to get interested in this many years ago now, and what we did, just some very simple cell experiments to see if there was a story here with HDL and diabetes. Now, what we did is we took beta cells, and these are the cells in the pancreas that produce and secrete insulin if blood glucose levels go up. And what we found was that if we took these beta cells and placed them with ApoA1 or ApoA2, you will get a significant increase in the ability of these cells to secrete insulin. And that could be a good thing, it could be a bad thing. If it's bad, it's because all it's doing is depleting the cells of insulin. But what we found over the long term is that that wasn't happening. So here we did a long-term experiment where we incubated these cells with ApoA1 or ApoA2 or HDL, and we got a lot of insulin secreted into the medium. And what we looked for to see whether the amount of insulin in the cells had decreased, and it hadn't. So what is going on here, and I haven't got time to talk about it today, but we do have some answers, is that the ApoA1 or the ApoA2 and the HDLs actually are increasing the production of insulin in beta cells, which is a good thing. Now, one thing I do want to mention in the HDL raising studies that were done with CETP inhibitors, there was a lot, especially in the beginning, of anecdotal evidence that it was improving glycemic control in people that had diabetes. This is a CETP inhibitor trial which failed, had severe off-target effects, was meant to go for 4.5 years. It only went for 18 months, and there were over 15,000 subjects in this trial. So it was a very significant trial. I just want to pass over a couple of these slides because they've actually somehow or other got repeated. But this is what I want to show you, is that what happened in the people that had type 2 diabetes in this study, and there were over 2,000 that were randomized just to a titrated dose of atorvastatin to lower LDL cholesterol. And then there was another arm of the study in which people were treated with atorvastatin plus the CETP inhibitor torcetrapib, which increased HDL levels. So the people that were treated with torcetrapib had lower blood glucose levels across 12 months. They also had reduced HbA1c, which is an average measure of glycemic control over a 3-month period. And so the lower the HbA1c level, the better the glycemic control. So this has worked very well. And we also had just data at baseline and month 3 for HOMA-IR, which is an algorithm for measuring insulin sensitivity in type 2 diabetes. This is a good indication of how the diabetes is being managed, and you can see it at baseline, no difference between the two groups, and a significant reduction in insulin resistance in the people that were treated with torcetrapib and had high HDL levels. Now, it doesn't mean to say the HDL was responsible for this, but it is clearly a strong association. Okay, if we move on to hypertension and its complications, you'll be hearing much more about this a little down the track, but you can see there's a whole lot of complications of hypertension, including stroke. As you increase HDL cholesterol levels, what you find is a reduction in systolic and diastolic blood pressure, and this is quite recent data. It also mirrors data from quite some time ago in the Physicians' Health Study, where men with the highest HDL levels had a decreased risk of developing hypertension compared to those in the lowest level. How does this happen? Well, what HDL can do, if you stop and think about hypertension, one of the precipitating factors is damage to the endothelium. So what we have here, if you look at, I think, yes, you can see sort of dark vertical lines on these slides. What you can see, that is a wound, and so it kind of mimics damage to the, damage to the endothelium. And what we were interested in, what's being shown here, is that if you add HDL to this, do you see an increase in the number of endothelial cells, and can they migrate across the damage and repair the damage? And the answer to that is clearly yes. And the final thing I want to show you here is one of the things about hypertension is you have stiffness of the artery wall. And so this is complicated, and you don't need to worry too much about it, other than to say that the higher these curves go, the more relaxed the artery is and the lower the blood pressure will be. And so what you can see here is HDL3C is the smallest, densest, high-density lipoprotein, is much better at relaxing arteries than the larger, less dense HDL2s. Now, a couple of things, and you're going to hear a lot more about dementia, so I don't want to dwell on this, but the point I want to make here is that there are a number of shared risk factors of dementia and cardiovascular disease that is not always recognized. Going to be hearing more about this later, so I don't want to talk too much about it, other than to say that one of the key drivers of all sorts of dementia, not just Alzheimer's disease, but all sorts of dementia, is the formation of something called A-beta peptide, which can go on to develop neurofibrillary tangles and amyloid plaques, and this is what actually is a really bad thing. And this is a really interesting study done some years ago, where mice that were overexpressing a cholesterol transporter called ABCA1, which will increase HDL levels, led to an increase in HDL, and what happened was that the A-beta was binding to the HDL and reducing the development of amyloid plaque, and you'll hear about this in much more detail down the track. And also HDL was found to inhibit inflammation in astrocytes, which is another brain cell. Final thing I want to mention is that ApoA1 has a role in rheumatoid arthritis. So this is a study we did some time ago, but people still mention it, so I think it kind of hit a chord. And what we did was we took female Lewis rats, we injected them with a substance called PGPS, and what this is, it's the cell wall of a bacterium called Streptococcus. And what it does is cause joint inflammation in rats. So if you take a rat and you inject it with PGPS, what you get is a really acute joint inflammation that goes into remission around day 8, 9, and then these rats develop chronic joint inflammation that ethics committees hate. And what happens what we did initially was we injected the rats with PGPS and also ApoA1 immediately before and immediately after. And this is what we found. We found a significant reduction in the acute and the chronic joint inflammation. Not particularly clinically relevant because you don't know when someone will get arthritis. And so we did the obvious study at the remission phase. We treated the rats with ApoA1 and we found similar reduction in joint inflammation. And that is basically all I want to tell you about this kind of overview, just to acknowledge people that have made a huge contribution over the years to all of these studies. And I'd like to thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much for the wonderful presentation. Please give her a big round of applause. Now we are going to have a Q&A. So regarding her presentation, if you have any questions, please raise your hand and we'll hand over the mic for you. Any questions from the audience, please?
Good morning, ma'am. I am Ashutosh Bahugna from Radar Research Institute. So, ma'am, as you shown in the slide number 19, that hazard ratios, they are decreasing with the increasing with the HDLC concentration. On the other side, there we find that the HDL hazards is also with the HDLC ratios increasing, is coming down. So, but is there some gold standard, or we can say some standard is there that this much HDLC level is very good, and if we cross that beyond that or going upward to that, then we can get some toxicity or some this hazards kind.
Not sure which study it is you're mentioning. I don't have the book.
Actually, ma'am, I mean to say that HDLC level, is there any standard HDLC level that we can say if we cross that HDLC level, that is good. If we are beyond or less than that HDLC level, it is not good.
Oh, I see what you mean. There isn't a definitive cutoff point that we have at the moment. So it's likely to also be variable from individual to individual. So I think the answer to that is no, we don't have that.
Again, ma'am, that is the slide number 47, where you develop the arthritis.
Yes.
And then we injected that ApoA1 for the treatment of the arthritis, and some results is somewhat convincing kind. Is that ApoA1 is again going inside the body and it is converting to the HDL, or directly that ApoA1 is showing some some beneficial effect?
We didn't track where the ApoA1 went. It wasn't labeled. Mostly when you inject, we've done studies like this in mice with radiolabel. When you inject ApoA1, and this was done intraperitoneally, before you can actually measure anything, all of the radiolabeled ApoA1 in mice is associated with the HDL fraction. That's before you can collect a blood sample as quickly as you can. It's all there. I presume it's the same in rats, but we didn't actually do it in that study.
Okay, thank you.
That's fine.
네, 질문 감사합니다. 하나
Any
정도 더
questions from the
받도록
audience?
하겠습니다. 질문 있으신
No
분은
questions?
손을 들어주시면 마이크 가져다 드리겠습니다. 네, 알겠습니다. 그럼 이상으로 교수님의 발표 마치도록 하겠습니다. 감사합니다. 박수 부탁드리겠습니다.